Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Inference Podcast. I am Michele, your host, and today I'm incredibly happy to have here with me Rita Kozlov from Cloudflare. Welcome, Rita. How are you?
I'm good. So excited to be on the podcast.
Yeah, that's really exciting for me to talk with someone coming from Cloudflare, which is a company I love and I quite use daily from quite some time now, and it's really exciting to me to speak with someone coming from there. So I'm really happy to have you here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. First of all, always love to hear from a fan of our products. It's something that, yeah, gets us excited is to have people actually using what we're building. So, as a bit of introduction of myself, I'm Rita. I'm a director of product at Cloudflare. So, I primarily focus on developer experience around the Workers platform, which we'll be talking about today, which is Cloudflare's serverless platform. I've been around at Cloudflare for a while, especially in tech terms. I've been around for over 5 years. So I started out originally as a solutions engineer, working with many of our customers, many of our enterprise customers, helping them get onboarded onto Cloudflare. And when Cloudflare Workers came out, it felt like something that really had the opportunity to change not just the trajectory of the company, but the trajectory of how cloud computing works in general. So yeah, it's been great seeing it evolve so much over the past few years from just a small toy that allowed you to deploy functions to people now fully building applications on it.
Yeah, I got it. So talking about the company specifically, I remember when I first started using Cloudflare, like, I don't know, 8 years ago, maybe. Yeah, it should be 8 years ago. I remember I started using Cloudflare because of its CDN capabilities, and I've seen the company grow in many different directions. So would you like to tell us how Cloudflare is expanding those days to other forms of, computing capabilities, or it's not just a CDN anymore, it's something bigger and better. I mean, what would you like to share about the company today?
Sure. So if you look at Cloudflare from the very beginning, I think we knew that we didn't want to be in the business of just moving bytes back and forth, and that CDN was inevitably going to become a relatively commoditized business, right? So if that's all you're doing, there's going to be competition in the space, and we wanted to provide so much more than that. And even for folks that have been following us for a while, I think there are some really interesting announcements that we've made in the early days that really made us stand out as a player that sought not just to help accelerate websites, but really make the internet better. And I think one of those really interesting early investments was giving free SSL to everyone, which was pretty unheard of at the time. Cloudflare was the first one to do so. And so I think that really set the company on a course where at all times we're thinking about how do we build a smarter network, and how do we, as we grow out the network, right, as we invest in having more and more data centers in the world, what are all of the different ways in which we can leverage it to offer new services? So today, I would say there are kind of three big areas of investment. One is the core bread and butter of the company, which is DDoS, CDN, DNS, all of your infrastructure needs, right? Then the second category that we'll be talking about today is the developer platform. So what all do you need to build an application? And the way that Cloudflare arrived at this, and this is also quite a bit deep in our DNA, is we make lots of bets. We have an entire organization that Workers is actually under called ETI, which stands for Emerging Technology and Incubation, that runs many different experiments, and some of them are less successful than others. Like a really early bet that we took was building out support for AMP. Because what if AMP became the future of how everything was cached and all the traffic one day went to Google and Facebook? In retrospect, that's not at all what happened, right? But if you don't
Yeah.
make some wrong bets, you don't make the correct bets either. So Workers evolved out of that, and then it became clear that we needed to build out additional services. And then the third area of big area of investment today is around zero trust, which started out with Cloudflare's Access product, which again, a different way to look at the network, right? Instead of the network as kind of a shield for your origin, the way to look at it now was the network as an authentication layer into all of your internal applications. So VPN is something we've all used at one point, and most likely didn't enjoy. And so looking at the network and going like, wait a second, if it can protect an origin, why can't it protect something else? So I imagine there will be other things that Cloudflare will develop that be like, wow, that was so obvious as a way to leverage the network. But those are kind of the current areas, and then always listening to our customers and building out from there. Okay, so for example, the developer space, you have compute, but you need storage. Well, what exactly do you need? Let's offer something small and then continue building on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm really excited about the news that we will be talking about later on during the episode. You just announced a couple of days ago, if I'm not wrong. And it's really exciting to see a company moving in a direction where it's competing with giants in the cloud computing space. And it's doing that in the right way by providing, in my opinion, of course, but it's providing the right tools and the right workflow for enhancing the user experience and also the developer experience, which is something that, there are some providers that just doesn't care about it, but Cloudflare is, of course, one of those that wants us to be happy as engineers and also as users. So that's really interesting and exciting for me. Talking again about serverless computing, because I see Cloudflare is going in that direction about providing a complete serverless platform. I would like you to define, for those who don't know what serverless is yet, if you can define in a few words what serverless is and what advantages does it provide.
I think serverless is a really funny term in that I think if we do it right, there's going to be a whole generation of developers that grow up that are very confused by that term because they're not going to understand what the word server means, right? So
Okay.
a common criticism of that word is, wait a second, there are servers running somewhere, but the whole idea is not that there aren't actually servers. The idea is that developers shouldn't care about servers. So I, as a developer, should be able to focus on what's really important to me and my users, really, right? Building out the actual core logic of the application, adding new features, making it better. But I shouldn't have to worry about everything from like the physical layer. So buying maybe an actual box, but that was solved to an extent by VMs and cloud computing, right? And I think serverless takes it a step further into, not having to worry about things like how do I configure Kubernetes or multi-tenancy, or how do I install Nginx and Apache and all of that kind of stuff. And the whole idea is you snap your fingers and you create a new function, and the only thing that you should have to care about is the code.
Okay, you hit a point. You made a great point. I almost feel guilty for using the serverless word, but I feel like I will never use that again because this is true. This is absolutely true. There are servers somewhere. We just don't care about them because there's someone else doing the hard work for us. That's absolutely true. And okay, so talking about cloud computing, I'm gonna call this that way from now, from now further. Talking about computing, I see Cloudflare competing with big players, as I said before, in the industry, such as AWS or Google Cloud or also Microsoft Azure. How do you see today Cloudflare to be positioned while competing with those players?
That's a really good question. I think as it goes in a classic David Goliath situation, right? You're not going to beat them by being stronger or beat them by going head to head with them on their own turf. So I think the long-term strategy here is to somewhat leapfrog where they're currently at, right? So let's talk about some of the differences first. Cloud computing providers, as you know them today, are generally based around really large centralized data servers, right? So GCP, for example, or AWS have these massive server farms that are located in relatively speaking, few regions around the world. The way that Cloudflare was built from the beginning is the complete opposite of that, right? It's been distributed from the very beginning. Everything that we do, basically, we run at 200 data centers around the world. And so it creates almost an inverse dynamic in how everything works. Because with traditional cloud, you generally start with one region, and then if the best case scenario happens, which is success, right? You now have to start thinking about how do you expand into other regions. If you care about users there and you care about latency, even if you just care about your particular region, you now have to think about how do I scale this. The way that Cloudflare is architected, like I said, is the exact opposite of that. So you can start by having access to like every single region around the world. Everything that you build can be built for a global audience. And if you need to, you can narrow it down, right? So with recent regional restrictions and laws like GDPR and data sovereignty and all of that becoming more and more relevant, you can always tell Cloudflare like, hey, I want my things to only be served out of here in order to be compliant. But it's an opposite model from, going back to, you asking me like, what does serverless mean? What could, I think it's very ironic that the very first thing that you have to do when you deploy a serverless function like Lambda is it asks you, what region do you want it in? Do you want it in US East 1? And that makes me think about servers, right? Because that's why you're asking me. It's like, where do you want me to put the server? Whereas I think Cloudflare has a very unique opportunity to take that concept so much further and really allow developers to not really think about that.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. That's really clear. And once again, I'm finding myself to, learn many new things during this episode already. So thank you personally for that. You already mentioned AWS Lambda, so that opens, paves the ground for my next question, which is, what are Cloudflare Workers? I mean, we already discussed the distribution model for Cloudflare infrastructure, and now I would like to ask you about Cloudflare Workers, which, if I remember correctly, it's your main focus area inside Cloudflare, right?
That's right. I love all of the Cloudflare products, but if I had to pick a favorite,
Okay.
Cloudflare Workers are Cloudflare's functions as a service. So the way that they work is they allow you to deploy JavaScript functions that instantly get distributed to all of Cloudflare's network edge. The way that came to be is actually really interesting, and I think it's a really good story of how constraints can sometimes lead to really interesting innovation that kind of takes things a step further. I mentioned earlier the way that workers work is you write a simple JavaScript function and it gets deployed everywhere. One distinction between workers and something like Lambda, in addition to the difference between where they get deployed to, is the how. So Lambda, the way that it works, and that's how most traditional functions and services work, is behind the scenes. Every time you deploy a Lambda, a container spins up. With Cloudflare Workers, we spin up something that's called a V8 isolate. So whether or not you know it, you're actually already familiar with V8 isolates because they run in the browser. That's how Google Chrome basically protects each one of your tabs, right? Each one of your sessions, and make sure that JavaScript can't break out and create security problems for you. And so it's a really secure model for running compute. But a really big difference is they're much, much smaller than a container. And a big part of that is the language runtime is always included. And so the only thing that we have to bring in every single time is the code. Everything else is already there. Whereas with something like Lambda, you have to instantiate kind of the entire thing every single time.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting talk. I didn't know the whole, structure behind the Cloudflare Workers. This is incredibly interesting, and I can clearly see that the taken approach is way different from other competitors, such as, of course, Google Cloud Functions or AWS Lambda and Azure Functions, I think they're called, and that's really interesting. One thing I personally like about what Cloudflare is becoming is how it's integrating with a whole suite of products that can really help us build complete applications running on the Cloudflare infrastructure. So would you like maybe to talk about how Cloudflare Workers can integrate with a KV storage or Cloudflare Cache or other products that you have in the Cloudflare suite?
Sure. I actually think that the integration part of it is a really key part in what makes it so much easier to use. So I'll tell you a few different integrations that Workers works with. So first of all, I'll start with the cache because it's been our good friend since day one, right? So actually, without having to configure anything on the worker at all, you immediately get access to the Cloudflare cache and are able to take advantage of it. So whenever you call fetch from a worker, which is the same fetch as the JavaScript standard library fetch, right? If you're fetching something like a static asset, it's going to adhere to the standard cache controls, and if it can be cached, it's going to be cached in the Cloudflare cache. Now, there's an additional API that's introduced through the Workers runtime called the Cache API, which gives you even more granular control over the cache. So you can take anything, whether it's an asset that you just fetched, or maybe you just made a pretty expensive calculation or created some content, right? And you want to put it in the cache so that you don't have to rerun that computation every single time. And so the Cache API gives you this great access to ephemeral storage. It's not going to be there forever, but or a really great example of something you might use it for is an authentication token, right? You only need it to be there for X amount of time. Worst case, you can always re-authenticate and issue a new one, right? You can be pretty self-assured that the customer will reliably always hit the same data center. And so, yeah, you can store it in the cache. And it's basically, it's also like a key value store, but ephemeral. And then you have Workers KV, which, unlike the Cache API, is permanent. So it's really easy to configure. You can go through the UI and create a new namespace. And the concept is super, super simple. You can create keys and values to go with them. One of the kind of most basic primitives of computer science, right? But what's really great about it is, again, it has really tight integration into Workers and has support for custom APIs in the runtime too. So if you want to retrieve something from a KV namespace, it's as easy as calling namespace.get. If you want to put something in it, it's as easy as calling .put. So the idea is to give developers all of the tools that they need as kind of close to them as we possibly can. And then one of our other products that we actually haven't talked about so far, but is kind of a sibling of Workers, is Cloudflare Pages. So Pages allows developers to deploy static sites onto, again, Cloudflare's edge. And this is where you can actually, again, leverage Workers to take it beyond static and add dynamic functionality to it. And one of the things that we're working on is making that experience. We're always looking to make our products play as nicely together as possible. So one of the things that we're working on is making it even more closely integrated so that whenever you put a particular function in the API directory of your project, we'll just deploy it as a worker. It just work.
Okay, that's insane. I mean, I'm thinking about the Vercel model for deploying Next.js websites, where I think they're doing the exact same thing in certain ways where they're deploying static pages into a CDN basically, and then they are executing all the server-side rendered pages and the API pages from Lambda because they're using Lambda underneath. And I'm thinking that maybe that's a great solution that Cloudflare could provide. I mean, it's not something I'm inventing. It's something I'm thinking that could work, of course. And the advantages I see in such solution, it's incredible because, of course, we are running at the edge. We are not relying on a single region deployment. We are executing our server-side renderings and our API calls on a distributed network of data centers, which is incredible when I think how I currently think about distributing my applications. So this is a real point of interest for me, and I will definitely check this out. This is really, really interesting, and thank you again for sharing this because this is possibly game changer for many developers working with frameworks such as Next.js or Next, or that kind of front end frameworks, of course, that needs some server-side code. And okay, talking more about Cloudflare Workers, I would like to ask you maybe to talk about the pricing model, if you like, because I've seen a very competitive pricing model around Cloudflare Workers, and I would like you maybe to explain that to the audience.
Absolutely. So Cloudflare Workers actually has two two different pricing models, and you can opt into whichever one makes most sense to you, depending on what you're building, right? Because we know that there's a big variety of use cases that people are building on Workers. And so I'll start with Workers bundled. So the way that it works is, first of all, one thing that I should note is either way, Cloudflare Workers offers a really, really generous free tier. So included in the free tier are 100,000 requests per day. And just to give you a good sense of order of magnitude, which is basically what we aim for, is if your project goes live on Hacker News and is trending on the front page, generally 100,000 requests should be enough to last you the day
Okay.
with that traffic spike, right? So that's kind of the idea. So the idea is anyone should be able to get started really easily without having to put down a credit card or anything like that. And then and actually, I'll also mention that KV also has a free tier. So no matter what you're building, you should be able to get started. Then for most basic use cases, we have what's called Workers Bundled. So it's $5 a month. You get, I believe, 10 million requests a month included
Wow.
in that. And yeah, the only thing and then it's 50 cents for each additional million requests.
Okay.
And so, yeah, you can really do a lot with it. It's limited to 50 milliseconds of CPU time. And this is where I think it's really important to pause for a second to make a really important distinction. Because a lot of people hear 50 milliseconds of CPU time and think, that's not enough time for me to do most things. What if I need to make an API call? The network time alone is going to take more time than that, right? Well, the interesting thing with CPU time is that we're only counting the time that the worker is doing any actual work itself. So any network calls or anything like that don't count towards that time. So in terms of what you can do with the worker is quite a bit. And I can also say, I think the vast majority of workers I've seen everyone thinks their code is going to take a very long time and is very complex, but most of it takes like 5 to 10 milliseconds, if that.
Okay.
And you can keep us honest, you'll get like graphs and metrics and all of that. Now, for heavier compute use cases, we also have Workers Unbound. It is similarly inexpensive, so I think like 15 cents per million requests. But there you also get a variable on the time that the worker is spending, and that one is based on wall clock time. But you can go for as long as the worker can go for as long as 30 seconds if you needed to. So it really opens up a lot of options, and especially I think that's more compelling for things like cron jobs where you maybe want to do some sort of transformation or something like that that might be a bit more computationally expensive. But yeah, one of the benefits, I talked earlier a bit about how workers are different from something like Lambda in that they use isolates rather than containers. And one of the benefits, like we always talk about things like technologies, right? And it's one thing that there's cool, innovative technology, but I think the really important part of it is in terms of the value that it actually brings back to the users. And one of the things that it actually allows us to do is because we're able to fit so many more isolates per machine, right, than you would be able to do with containers, it allows us to pass those cost savings onto our users, which is why you're able to get such good pricing out of it.
Okay, thank you. I was one of those that thought, okay, 50 milliseconds maybe are too small for me, but eventually I tested them myself and found out that they are absolutely enough for the vast majority of my problems. And I gotta say, if your code on CPU time takes more than 50 milliseconds, maybe a Lambda or a worker it's not well suited for that kind of program. Let's call it program. Okay, so that was my idea after working a bit with workers, of course. And one thing I've tried, and I'd like to ask you, as for now, if I remember correctly, workers only accepts JavaScript as language, right?
That's right. We support some other languages through WebAssembly. So actually, just the other day, we announced much better support for Rust, where Rust now basically has all the native APIs that we support for JavaScript included in it. Because of the model, you're not going to see support for things uh, for languages like Python maybe as quickly, but anything that can be compiled to WebAssembly can be run on workers as well.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. And also, every single language that can compile to JavaScript can be used. I mean, I think of Scala, for example, or Clojure with ClojureScript. We can basically run a ton of languages on Cloudflare Workers by compiling them to JavaScript and maintaining the developer experience we love with our languages of choice. So that's an interesting thing.
And we have some templates to get started with those as well. So you actually don't have to wire up all the tooling yourself in order to compile things into JavaScript. If you use Wrangler, which is our CLI, and go to our docs, you'll see that we have links to templates that you can just copy paste into Wrangler Generate and get bootstrapped with them.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a nice suggestion. And also talking about your CLI, I was almost forgetting about that, but I definitely want to talk about that. I tested Cloudflare Workers locally with your CLI, which is awesome. But I would like you to introduce maybe the tools that Cloudflare is giving developers for developing workers locally.
Absolutely. So Wrangler is our official Cloudflare CLI. It can help you do things like deploy your workers, but it can also help you with local development and debugging. So I actually think this is quite interesting. One of the first tool that we introduced to Wrangler to let you to give you the instantaneous feedback that you need while you're developing is Wrangler Dev. And what's really interesting about it is that unlike a traditional local development environment, it actually connects to the edge. If you think about it, the edge is already so close to you because there's probably a data center within milliseconds of you, that you still get that really fast feedback loop. whenever you're iterating, but you're also getting the benefit of, because it's actually running on the edge, not ending up in a scenario where you're like, oh, I tested it and it works fine on my machine, and then you deploy it and then something entirely different happens. However, people do love to still develop truly locally, and like maybe you're on a train, on a plane, etc. And so we actually just last week announced that we were going to integrate a tool called MiniFlare into our CLI. That's a local emulator of the Workers environment that has really, really great developer experience and makes it really easy to develop with Workers.
Wasn't MiniFlare a community-supported project, or am I wrong?
You're absolutely right. It came from a community contributor of ours named Brandon. He graciously agreed to come on to our team as an intern. Uh, Clearly has a bright future ahead of him. And yeah, it was really great to see that kind of tool come from the community, and the community embraced it so much that it was a no-brainer to officially support it.
Okay, yeah, I was surprised when I saw it migrating from a single profile account on GitHub to the Cloudflare organization, and I was really happy to see people succeed in that way, because it's really inspiring. I guess not just for me, but for the whole development community, and that's something great that I want to highlight when I talk about Cloudflare. I mean, taking the ownership of such projects coming from the community, it's not something common from big companies. And that's another bonus point, I would say, for Cloudflare, because it shows how the company can care about the community, which is something really, really special, again, when compared to other solution providers.
I was just going to say, we care about our community a lot. And we just created a Discord for Workers about a year ago. And it's incredible the things that people build, and seeing people meet each other, and like you said, the tools that come out of the community. And it's something that's I think really important to the success of the platform. And yeah, we're really supportive of and are going to continue to support.
Okay, yeah, that's really, really nice to see. And I would like to go into the conclusion for this episode that has been incredibly useful. How do you see the future of Cloudflare as a complete cloud provider? We already talked about many new stuff that Cloudflare just announced, but what can you spoiler us for the future?
Well, let me put it this way. We talked earlier about the other big cloud providers and how Cloudflare is rethinking it in terms of, okay, if we were to do it now, knowing what we know now in 2021, right? What would that future look like? And we started out with Workers, right, which is compute on the edge. And today we announced R2, which is an S3 competitor. It's our object storage that we're going to give to developers. And we're going to continue developing more and more of these primitives that our customers are used to having in their compute providers to unlock more types of applications being built. So one thing that I think back to is when AWS was first started, the first kind of three core services were S3, EC2, and SQS, right? Queues. Make of that what you will. But certainly that's something that we want to support in the future too. And yeah, I think we'll continue building out more and more things that make developers' lives easier.
Okay, thank you, Rita. That has been an incredible episode. Thank you again for being there. I really wish you a great future at Cloudflare, and I really wish to have you again, maybe in the future when the Cloudflare team is, rolling out something new, because I truly believe this is gonna create some good competition in the cloud computing field. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon.